Hepcats, entirely written and illustrated by Martin Wagner, began as a self-published comic in 1989. Over the next 5 years, the series would be plagued with financial difficulties and extensive delays between issues. After the 12th issue, released in 1994, it would just disappear. However, Hepcats would resurface 2 more times, with promises of completing the acclaimed storyline, Snowblind. But despite assurances that work was being produced, there would be no further installments. Even though Hepcats was extremely well done, the series was a casualty of many different factors. However, let's start at the beginning and look at the history of the series. Hepcats began in 1987 as a newspaper strip in the Daily Texan, a student newspaper, where it would run for 2 years. Wagner described it as, quote, highly and unabashedly derivative, stylistically, of Doonesbury and Bloom County, unquote. According to Wagner, around this time he got back into reading comics. He mentions both Cerebus by Dave Sim and the Mobius reprints done by Epic Comics as favorites, as was Akira by Katsuhiro Otomo. All were an inspiration to attempt his own comic book series. Doing so would give him the opportunity to do longer, more in-depth stories that weren't 4 horizontal panels that ended with a punchline. Dave Sim also influenced Wagner to begin self-publishing. In the late 1980s, Sim regularly spoke about the benefits of such a pursuit, and he'd inspire others to follow his lead. This is why creators like Alan Moore and Steve Bissette started their own publishing companies. Like Wagner's own publishing venture, they would all collapse in a relatively brief amount of time, leaving behind interesting projects that would remain incomplete. Regardless, in 1989, Wagner published the first issue of Hepcats. The first 5 issues came out somewhat regularly, and then noticeable delays began to occur. According to Wagner, sales of the comic were terrible since independent black and white comics were not supported by either distributors or retailers, and he had to take real jobs to fund new issues. This was a topic he extensively wrote about in 1998. He was also very picky about his artwork, and that affected production time. Finally, in 1991, his marriage fell apart, and this caused an added financial and emotional burden. All of these factors caused delays between issues, and eventually, all were the reason the comic suddenly stopped in 1994. Wagner made no public announcement, and after publication of the 12th issue, he participated in an extensive interview with the Comics Journal, where he gave no indication that he had decided to stop production. In fact, while allegedly inking the unseen 13th issue, Wagner had this to say, quote, I'd like to be doing Hepcats for many years, as I go from callow youth to my wise old age. The idea is 100 issues, which, knowing my pace, will probably take some time. Unquote. The following year, he reprinted the first part of Snowblind in a trade paperback, possibly hoping that revenue would help fund future issues. Both the optimistic interview and the reprint gave the appearance that Hepcats was still being worked on. However, from what Wagner has subsequently written, this was not the case. Being a self-publisher with a labor-intensive comic that sold less than 1,000 copies was too much disappointment to endure. That being said, in 1996, Antarctic Press offered Wagner a deal to become Hepcats' publisher. This would allow him the ability to focus exclusively on the comic and produce new material. That same year, the series was relaunched with a special colorized 0 issue that acted as an introduction. Within that 0 issue, Wagner wrote about the various problems he had encountered and how Antarctic Press offered him the ability to finally finish the story he initially envisioned. In that introduction, Wagner stated, quote, Antarctic Press will be re-releasing the first 12 issues of Hepcats on a monthly basis. This will give me the time to finish the rest of Snowblind, so those issues can come out monthly or bi-monthly after that. Unquote. Within those reprints, Wagner supplied a new cover and 4 pages of new material for a story he intended to do after Snowblind was complete. However, after 4 issues, this new material stopped, with only a few additional pages appearing a year later in issue number 7. This seemed to indicate that Wagner was again having trouble producing new material. The reprint issues also experienced major delays for unspecified reasons. Ironically, like with the original series, the delay began after issue number 5. There was an 8-month gap between the 5th and 6th issue. Afterwards, it seemed like Antarctic Press began to reprint the series as fast as possible to finish off their contractual obligation. and then Hepcats abruptly ended again. The promised Snowblind story was never completed, even though Wagner had more than a year to prepare new material. It wouldn't be known until years later, in 2008, that, at some unknown point, while the series was being reprinted, Wagner himself disappeared and stopped communicating with Antarctic Press. He claimed burnout and personal disarray as the reason he disappeared. Also in 2008, Wagner announced he would publish Hepcats as a webcomic, 5 pages of which were uploaded to Flickr and can still be viewed to this very day. Needless to say, those are the only new pages that exist, and a webcomic never materialized. At this point, it's safe to say that Hepcats is an utterly dead project. It's been almost 20 years since Hepcats originally stopped, and it would be difficult to believe there will be a conclusion to Snowblind or any new Hepcats material. In a related note, Wagner had a fully funded Kickstarter project in 2014. That project was supposed to be a documentary about a series of serial crimes in Austin, Texas in 1885. Even though it greatly surpassed its goal, the documentary has never been completed. For the record, the campaign itself can still be found on Kickstarter, and 2 promotional videos can be found on YouTube. In other words, any future Wagner projects, especially ones requiring financial backing, would probably be met with a substantial level of cynicism. But if you're looking to be generous and fund someone who consistently delivers video products, there's a link to my Patreon in the description. Now that's some fine integrated self-promotion worthy of support. The series was an excellent example of independent work from the early 90s. It's easily grouped with contemporary comics such as Bone by Jeff Smith and Strangers in Paradise by Terry Moore. Artistically speaking, it would be hard not to notice the influence of Cerebus, especially Gerhard's lovely, detailed backgrounds. Although the staging of scenes certainly evokes Dave Sim's cinematic approach. In particular, static camera angles, where the figure is the only movement in the panel. Which isn't to suggest Wagner merely copied these 2 artists. He did have his own unique flair that elevated the material with his developing sensibilities. Wagner's voice, in both the writing and artwork, was very much his own, and as the series developed, both were becoming more refined. The first 2 issues are amusing introductions to the main characters. There are the roommates, Joey and Gunther, and the romantic couple, Arnie and Erica. These were characters established in the newspaper strip, but they were all reintroduced as the main characters of the ongoing comic book series. In a nutshell, they are 20-somethings that are getting a handle on life and learning responsibility. Like most people that age, they're a bit self-obsessed and try to get all they can out of life while avoiding being responsible grown-ups that have rent and other bills to pay. The 3rd issue is where the series takes on a more serious, dramatic tone. This issue began the storyline titled Snowblind, and it was intended to be complete by the 20th issue. It focused mainly on Erica and her past. Now, due to certain restrictions I face, there's only so much explicit detail I can give without being penalized with an age restriction that will limit the exposure of this video and possibly future videos, so I have to tread lightly. But I can mention the Snowblind story contains some pretty heavy plot beats that feel very real and rather disturbing. As we learn, Erica's past is quite traumatic, with heartbreaking reveals, and it all revolves around instances of parental abuse. In fact, Erica is actually Catherine, a young woman who ran away from home after discovering her father was inflicting the same abuse on her younger sister. Years later, her older brother finds her, and, when Erica is confronted with her past, she metaphorically ends the life she had been living. This metaphorical end leads to increased concern from her partner, Arnie, who doesn't yet realize the woman he's known for years is actually someone else entirely. The first part of Snowblind ended in issue 10 and was collected in a Snowblind trade paperback. The next 2 issues, and presumably the entire focus of the second part, was elaborating on what happened to Erica after she ran away and how she survived. Unfortunately, the series didn't continue beyond issue 12, leaving Snowblind half complete. Critically speaking, there was only one plot point in Snowblind that seemed a bit weak. That being said, it was a weakness that only became apparent in later issues. It worked as clever misdirection at first, but once the story develops, it stands out as something that really didn't work within context. And that plot beat would be Erica's older brother not being forthcoming about who he is, and then engaging in some activities that reinforces the initial misdirection. Overall, it doesn't undermine the story, and it works dramatically, But once his identity is established, it stood out as something that, retroactively, lacked a certain level of logic. Even though Hepcats wasn't autobiographical, many of Wagner's direct and indirect experiences went into the Snowblind story. For example, Wagner's former wife, like Erica in Hepcats, was an exotic dancer. Both assumed stage personas that seemed to become the identity they would adopt as if they were real people. And both withheld their past from their partners, while possibly fabricating aspects of it to protect their secrets. Additionally, Wagner knew someone who had endured a horrific episode of assault. Somehow, through strength of character, this woman wasn't destroyed by an encounter that should have had a debilitating emotional trauma permanently associated with it. These factors were directly represented in Snowblind, although naturally, they were fictionalized and adapted to Erica's character. Still, it would be hard not to suggest that Wagner had a personal connection to the material he was producing, and when his real marriage to this exotic dancer fell apart, that may have affected his ability to continue the story. It may have been subconsciously difficult to craft an empathetic, revealing story about a woman moderately based on the woman he had recently divorced. Again, it's hard not to conclude this was a partial reason why Snowblind the series stalled at a certain point. Naturally, this leads to the question, is it worth reading even though it suddenly stops? Honestly, yes. It's some pretty strong writing and artwork. While it's definitely not to everyone's tastes, it's a great example of independent work from that time. In the end, Hepcats is a series that deserved a better fate, the blame for which can be partially attributed to the time period it was published. But the majority of the burden is due to the creator's lack of dedication to the comic. The aforementioned Bone, Strangers in Paradise, and Poison Elves, along with A Distant Soil by Colleen Doran and Wandering Star by Terry Wood, all face the same challenges in the tumultuous environment of the 90s. Independent, black and white titles had to deal with a glut of mainstream superhero titles that drowned their presence out. And then, when the market crashed and sales plummeted, these independent titles had to find a safe harbor or go extinct. All found sympathetic publishers that allowed them the ability to complete the story they wanted to tell. Hepcats was in a similar position. Its original self-published run was plagued with delays that undoubtedly hurt its potential. This erratic schedule made it difficult to grow an audience and keep the one that was actually interested. Furthermore, the comic may have achieved acclaim and buzz, but that quickly fades when there's no new material to support the accolades. Then, when a new publisher stepped in, giving Wagner an opportunity to focus exclusively on the book, the creator couldn't deliver new material. So really, the market may have been less than supportive, but the creator was also very, very inconsistent. And when given a second chance, he disappeared for a decade without any indication why he left. In some ways, one can look at the Hepcats saga as a cautionary tale for developing creators. You may have the talent and ideas to tell an engaging story, but unless you sit down and do the damn work, you're never going to find an audience to support you. Yes, those words are easy to say, but as someone who's existed in obscurity for 6 years, relative to similar channels, I can say you have to do the best work you can on a consistent schedule. Also respect the audience you have and keep on keeping on. If ego, disappointment, or financial gain take on a deciding role, you'll never get anything done. All that's left to say is thank you for watching, or listening, whatever the case may be. Thanks to all my fine supporters on Patreon and on YouTube. If you have the ways and means, please help out. I'm about a third of the way to my overall goal of being able to do this full time, so any and all support is greatly appreciated. Extra special thanks to Phil Sagan, Edward Clayton Andrews, Corey Drew, Alexa Zernish, Brian Deaton, Johnny Lim, Steve White, Taylor Dull, and Matt Marino. You are all justified and ancient. Hey, look, a playlist. Why not watch some other videos? Until next time.